For the first few decades of its existence, New Line Cinema became known for their genre films and edgy fare, but with a growing interest in prestigious films aimed at a sophisticated audience, they felt it was time to start a division to release those kinds of movies. Ira Deutschman was appointed the head of the unit named Fine Line Features and founded in 1991. Fine Line would throw the dice at a number of independent films, both delivered in-house and acquired for distribution. One of Fine Line's earliest successes was the Gus Van Sant drama My Own Private Idaho, which had struggled to find interested studios. However, feeling it was the right fit for this new unit, they picked it up and the end result was a decent-sized art house hit. Fine Line sought to pick up films by up-and-coming indie filmmakers and established directors as well as international titles. A notable acquisition was Jim Jarmusch's anthology film Night on Earth, which while not a box office breakout, was well received and like Jarmusch's other work did eventually develop an audience. A major get for Fine Line was Robert Altman's satirical Hollywood comedy The Player. In addition to rave reviews, the film managed to appeal to even those outside of the film industry bubble, and despite only playing in limited release, The Player spent several weeks in the top 10. Altman would even reteam with Fine Line a few more times in the 90s for his ensemble film Shortcuts and the crime movie Kansas City. Like I said, they would look at films from other countries to distribute in the United States, picking up movies from notable directors like Ken Loach and Mike Leigh. While most of the movies were cheap enough to produce and acquire that an underwhelming box office did not hurt Fine Line too much, there was the occasional film that did not work out. The thriller Dark Blood was set to be released by Fine Line, but River Phoenix died during production before his scenes could be completed. The project was put on hold while the producers tried to figure out how to press forward, but it was eventually abandoned, and it would take almost 20 years for the director to complete and release the movie. Meanwhile, Gus Van Sant was trying to piece together his film Even Cowgirls Get the Blues and re-edit it after its premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival, delaying the release by several months. When it was finally released, it flopped as critics destroyed the film and audiences stayed away. But when Fine Line did get a breakout, they especially reaped benefits. They acquired David O. Russell's first feature, Spanking the Monkey, which did well, and they especially scored a hit with the basketball documentary Hoop Dreams. Even with it being an almost 3-hour documentary, not normally a ticket for box office success, audiences responded to the movie and it became a hit. There was even widespread outcry when it did not receive a Best Documentary nomination at the Oscars, although it did become the rare documentary nominated for Best Film Editing. It was considered such a shocking omission, it even led to changes of how documentaries were nominated at the Academy. Another movie they released would similarly receive a lot of attention, albeit for different reasons. That was David Cronenberg's Crash, which became highly controversial for its sexual scenes after premiering at the Cannes Film Festival. Fine Line picked up the Canadian production but ran too few issues of its release. For one, the MPA gave the movie an NC-17, which limited its potential distribution. The other problem came from Ted Turner, whose Turner Entertainment owned New Line and Fine Line. He absolutely hated the movie, finding its graphic content sleazy, and the American release was delayed as a result. It was only after Time Warner bought Turner that Crash was eventually released on American screens several months after it opened in Canada. Makes me wonder how many Cronenberg fans crossed the border just to see what was provoking people so much. Another major success for Fine Line was the Australian musician biopic Shine. Beating out several other indie distributors for the North American rights, the movie was a sizable hit and earned a Best Picture nomination, along with Geoffrey Rush winning the Oscar for Best Actor. Another award success for them was Adam McGowan's The Sweet Hereafter, which Fine Line picked up for American distribution and earned surprise Oscar nominations for directing and writing. They also released Woody Allen's Deconstructing Harry during a period when he was going through multiple distributors. John Waters had long made films for New Line Cinema, even partly helping to put them on the map, but his film Pecker would end up releasing under Fine Line. And speaking of provocative filmmakers, Fine Line would release Harmony Korine's first two directing efforts, Gummo and Julian Donkey Boy, in addition to Lars von Trier's tragic musical Dance in the Dark and Todd Solondz's dark comedy Storytelling. With these movies and Crash, it showed Fine Line was not too bothered by offbeat films and material that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. They seemed to do well mixing these with less potentially controversial fare that could appeal to awards voters. There was Tumbleweeds, which earned Janet McTeer an Oscar nomination, as did Javier Bardem for Before Night Falls, which was also the film that gained recognition outside of Spain. Meanwhile, David Mamet's Stayed in Maine was well received and won its own fair share of awards from critics groups. Fine Line would also release Human Nature, the least remembered of the movies written by Charlie Kaufman during that period. They picked up the musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which found a devoted cult following during its limited run and has continued to grow since then. Fine Line also looked at the films that fellow Time Warner subsidiary HBO was producing, finding ones they felt would do well theatrically. One of them was American Splendor, based on the comics by Harvey Pekar, which received rave reviews, solid box office, and an Oscar nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay. There was also Gus Van Sant's drama Elephant, a depiction of the Columbine High School shooting, which did well despite the controversial subject matter and experimental filmmaking style. Another HBO production they released was the drama Maria Fall Grace, about a young woman who becomes a drug mule. That was also critically and commercially successful and earned Catalina Sandina Moreno an Oscar nomination for Best Actress. Fine Line would reteam with John Waters on the comedy A Dirty Shame, which received an NC-17 rating. It is unfortunately to date the last feature film Waters has directed, as he has struggled to get financing for his films since then. Now that's a dirty shame. Fine Line would reteam with Mike Leigh when they handled the American release of his abortion drama Vera Drake. That movie was critically acclaimed and received 3 Oscar nominations. They had similar success with the Spanish film The Sea Inside, which won the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. Curiously, Jonathan Glazer's film Birth was originally greenlit by the Fine Line team and intended to be released under that label, but at some point New Line Cinema decided to take over and put the movie under their logo, although Fine Line still received it in association with credit. In 2005, Warner Brothers and New Line decided to close Fine Line and in its place created a joint venture between New Line and HBO Films named Picturehouse. Bob Burney, who ran New Market Films, was put in charge of the new division, which still retains some of the Fine Line employees and the films they're working on. So Picturehouse was essentially Fine Line Features 2.0. The unit did get off to a rough start with Gus Van Sant's loose Kurt Cobain biopic Last Days, which received mixed reviews and disappointing box office. Another biopic, The Notorious Betty Page, also did not take off. And yet another biopic, Fur, starring Nicole Kidman as photographer Diane Arbus, was thought to be a possible Oscar contender until the reviews came out and it flopped. They did release Robert Altman's final film, A Prairie Home Companion, which did modestly enough. Picturehouse finally scored a notable success with Guillermo del Toro's fantasy film, Pan's Labyrinth. The film pulled in a sizable audience, especially for a Spanish-language film, along with several Oscar nominations, winning in 3 crafts categories. They also did well with another international film, the Edith Piaf biopic, La Vie en Rose, with Marion Cotillard winning the Oscar. And while it only pulled in minimal box office, the documentary The King of Kongs, A Fistful of Quarters, was widely acclaimed and made Donkey Kong player Billy Mitchell more well-known and infamous. They handled the American release of the Spanish-language horror film The Orphanage, and even before it opened in the United States, New Line bought the rights to produce a remake, but it was never made. Picturehouse picked up the American rights to the British comedy Run, Fat Boy Run, although that was a bigger hit in the United Kingdom than the US. Despite some of these notable titles, Warner Brothers was unsatisfied with the grosses on many of the Picturehouse releases and decided to close both that and Warner Independent Pictures, choosing to get out of releasing specialty films through those specific units. WB would allow Picturehouse to release the last few remaining movies, including the family film Kit Kittredge, An American Girl, and the comedy The Women, a lot of which have been in development all the way back at Fine Line before going to Picturehouse. You might think this would be the end of Picturehouse, but in 2013, Bob Burney and his wife Jean Burney decided to buy the name and logo from Warner Brothers and relaunch it to continue to release independent films. Picturehouse's first new release was the Metallica movie Through the Never, although it was a box office disappointment. They also picked up the acclaimed thriller The Guest after its premiere at the Sundance Film Festival. It had a small theatrical release and only later found a substantial audience on streaming through a deal Picturehouse had with Netflix. They had primarily functioned as a distributor for National Geographic documentaries, releasing well-received films like Becoming Cousteau, The Territory, and The Tale of Cillian. And they distributed the Ukraine war documentary Porcelain War, which was nominated for an Oscar. So while far cry from when Picturehouse and its predecessor Fine Line Features were at Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema, it's still chugging along with a current focus on bringing people some highly acclaimed documentaries. Even with the troubles both indie distributors have gone through, they managed to find and release plenty of worthwhile and well-remembered movies. See you next time.